Presentation and precision casting is especially important when you're fishing for brown trout and grayling, or indeed any fish where you want to present a dry fly or a nymph with a drag-free drift. In this film we'll now take a look at precision casting, some of the tips and tricks and key points to a precise fly cast. After that we'll have a look at 5 different presentation casts. First I'll show you a very simple but very useful cast called the reachment. Then I'll show you another quite simple and very useful cast called the wiggle cast. After that I'll show you 2 different curved casts, one to the left and one to the right. And finally we'll have a look at the pile cast. There are 2 very important factors when you're casting for precision. Before anything, you must consider the trajectory of your cast. That is, when you cast to, let's say, a rising fish out here in the river, you need to angle your cast down so that the forward cast goes down towards the fish, and then, observing the rule of 180 degrees, the back cast has to go up. The closer to the surface your leader extends, the more precise your cast will be. So like this, I angle my forward cast down and my back cast up. And as you can see, my leader extends just before it lands on the surface. I'm stopping my hand in the back cast very early to give me that high back cast. Even though I'm only casting a short length of line, I'm also using the double haul. The reason for this is not as much to gain line speed as it is to eliminate slack from my cast. That greatly improves my line control and also improves my precision. The next cast I want to show you is probably the most useful cast a trout or grayling fisherman can use. It's popularly called the reach cast, but in fact it's technically not a cast, it's a mend. But be that as it may. Let's have a look at it. Let's say that I was casting across the current to a rising fish over by the opposite bank. If I simply presented a straight line, I would get a very short drift before my dry fly began skating on the surface. In order to give the fly a little bit longer drag-free drift, I can use what is called the reachment. Now the reachment is very simple to perform. What you do is you cast, and directly after you stop the rod, you push the rod tip upstream. That places a lot of line up current, giving you the possibility to follow the line downstream, giving the fly a longer drag-free drift. Now there's one thing to be aware of. If this is the distance I need to cast to cover the fish with my dry fly, watch what happens when I perform my reachment. I'm pulling the fly back. So in order to maintain the correct distance, you must remember to pull off an amount of line that you can let slip through the rod guides as you mend upstream. That way the fly lands where it's supposed to. It's a very simple cast and one that you definitely need to learn because you will be using it all the time. Now a couple of extra details around the reachment is that you can of course also reach downstream. That could be very useful in a situation where you're for instance fishing a wet fly or a streamer that you wish to speed up. If, when you make your reach cast, you reach up and then back, you are in fact performing what is called an aerial mend. You're placing a big bow of line out in the river, which you can use also to give a longer drag-free drift to your dry fly or even your nymph. And finally, of course, the reach cast also allows you to reach around an obstacle that you may have in front of you, be it a rock or a log or anything in the river. The wiggle cast is another great presentation cast that serves the purpose of placing a lot of slackline on the water. It's almost as simple to perform as the reach cast. Let me show you the basic principle of the wiggle cast. Now, as you're making your normal overhead cast, you simply, after you stop the rod, you wiggle the rod tip from side to side. One variation is, of course, to make lots of small wiggles or fewer big ones. That is just a matter of how you move your rod tip. Now the wiggle cast has the same problem as the reach mend. When I make the wiggles, I reduce the distance I cast. So just as in the reach mend, having some loose line ready is necessary so that you can, as you wiggle, you can shoot line. Another way to make sure that the fly lands where you want it to is to, in fact, when you're false casting, overshoot the target. That is to cast a little bit too far. And then when you make your wiggles, the fly lands where you want it to. This is a great cast to use in many different situations. It works great in a cross-current presentation like this one. It's even good to use when you're casting upstream, and also if you're presenting your dry fly downstream to a rising fish. So it's a very versatile cast that's well worth learning. That cast is known as an overpowered curve cast. It's not an easy cast to make, and it also has some weaknesses. One very important weakness is that in order to make the overpowered curve, you have to cast very low. In fact, you have to cast so low that your loop is horizontal instead of vertical. What happens is that the loop is coming from a horizontal plane with very high velocity, and as you stop the rod and the line straightens, it has so much power that it actually flips over to the opposite side and thus creates the curve. Obviously, this is not a very precise cast. It also suffers quite a lot from the wind, and it's not easy to learn. But it's one that I still recommend that you learn, because once in a while it will get you out of trouble. One major disadvantage of this cast is that in order to put the loop on its side, to make it curve over, you have to cast in a very low plane. And in a place like this, where you have a lot of bushes and trees and stuff, high grass around you, there's a high risk of catching that with your fly. But it's still a cast that's well worth practicing. Not as much to cast around obstacles, but if you can make the curve cast, you can actually use it to present the fly so that the fly enters the fish's window of vision before the fly line. That sometimes makes the difference between success and failure. So the overpowered left curve was a result of a horizontal cast with way too much power in it. If I want to curve to the right, I do the exact opposite. I make a underpowered cast where I also build in a really bad tracking error. Instead of tracking straight forward, I simply track in a banana-shaped movement. And that, together with a cast that really has way too little power, places my line and leader on the water in a curve that curves to the right. The pile cast is a cast that I use almost exclusively to present a dry fly downstream to a rising fish. It's quite a simple cast to make. Instead of just casting my normal straight line cast which would make my dry fly skate on the surface almost immediately as it lands. I think about the 180 degrees rule because what I want is to present the forward cast high, so I tilt my back cast down towards the water, and as I present my high forward cast, I also bring down the tip of the rod towards the surface. Let me show you what it looks like. Like this. Low back cast, high forward cast, and then down with the rod tip. And as you can see, the line falls in a lot of wiggles and piles, hence the name, the pile cast. Now, depending on how high you send up your forward cast, you can actually get a quite long, drag-free downstream drift to a rising fish. Two important things to remember about the pile cast is that 1, it's very sensitive to the wind, and 2, you must keep your line speed down, because if you cast too fast a line speed, the cast will land straight almost no matter what you do.